Hey APUSH gang, I hope that you can hear me loud and clear. I'm actually coming at you from my dining room table instead of my bedroom study where my desk is. My family, some of my family is home, so you may see them bebop in and out of here. So it's a Sunday afternoon and we're all kind of working on our own stuff. So anyway, I'm gonna jump back into where we left off on Wednesday. Hopefully you guys were able to watch John Green's crash course and on the progressive era. I believe that's the one that I had you guys watch. And so before we jump into our lesson today, which essentially is chapter 18, part 2, kind of the nuts and bolts of the progressive era, we're going to talk about some of the laws, some of the legislation, some of the events, some of the presidents. It's kind of chapter 18's the part of it that I didn't have you read. I read myself. It was kind of boring and pretty lengthy and just kind of all over the place, more about ideals than specific. So I'm going to try to communicate that to you in a nutshell, I guess you could say, in the lesson. So I would encourage you to print out the PowerPoint. I would encourage you to take notes because I'm going to be elaborating. So if you are wanting to, how shall we say, get the details out of this, then I would definitely take notes since you didn't read it, and I'm not going to require you to read it. Also wanted to just let you know that I've said this last time, but I found a gentleman who is reading Eric Foner's book, Give Me Liberty, on YouTube, and some of you did listen to it. It's not the same edition as ours. I couldn't tell from the picture if it was the 3rd edition or the 5th edition. The content is the same or similar. Apparently it was rewritten a little bit, and so if you try to follow it word for word in your book, you'll get really confused. So I would just encourage you to listen to it. So I have included the links to the reading on YouTube for your homework assignment, which jumps into chapter 19. So it's the first few pages of chapter 19. So I included that in our links today. Let me think what else. I was also going to ask you something. Throughout the course of my lesson today, I'm going to ask you probably 3 questions associated with periods 3 and 4. And in an attempt to make sure that you guys are paying attention to my instructions and my lectures, which will benefit you taking the test, I'm going to just kind of periodically throw those questions in there. And then what I want you guys to do is a little bit kind of what we did on Wednesday of last week. I'd like to start a strand on Google Classroom on the live stream where, since you're all watching this at a different pace, and I don't know that you're all watching it at the exact time. I'd like for whoever hears the question first to write their thoughts down. Like say, for instance, the question was, tell me a little bit about the presidency of James Madison. So the first person might jump in and say, James Madison was the 4th president of the United States. He was a good friend of Thomas Jefferson's. He, of course, was also the father of the Constitution. While he was president, he asked Congress to declare war on the British, something along those lines. And then the next person that would jump in would read what the previous person said and then add something to that. He was married to the delightful Dolly Madison, who served as the hostess of the White House and enjoyed entertaining important guests as they came into Washington, D.C. And then the next person might jump in and say, during the War of 1812, when James Madison was president, the British burned down the White House. The next person might say, Dolly Madison rescued a very famous painting of George Washington. The next person might say, James Madison and Henry Clay worked together on something called the American system, which was a system of developing America's economic system, their tariff systems, a new bank, and that sort of thing. And so that'll be kind of how it goes. So I'm going to probably provide you with 3 different topics, big topics or larger topics related to periods 3 and 4 in an attempt to help prepare you for the test, review some of that important information, and make sure that we are all contributing, all participating in the lecture and listening to the lecture. So And then also, there was something else I was going to say that I have family walking around and I'm trying to ignore them. I can't remember what it was. It'll probably come back to me. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the lesson today. And so where we were, just to do a little review, period 7. This are the years 1890 to 1945. We've delved into the Second Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age in the previous chapter. Last Wednesday, we started talking about the introduction or the beginning few pages of chapter 18, which was the big picture of the Progressive Era. And we're going to break that down a little bit. Period 7 talks about the Progressive Era, World War I, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, as well as World War II. So this is a huge, huge section. I would not be surprised at all, given the situation with the COVID crisis, that College Board decides to pull a question from this period. Since it's such a narrow options, you know, just one question, one DBQ, I wouldn't be surprised if they felt like it would be more fair to pick something from a more recent lesson. So I want to make sure that I hit all the important topics related to period 7, but there's a lot there. So let's see here. All right, next slide. You'll see a picture that has a little girl. I think I might have had this on the previous PowerPoint. And she is a child. She represents the children that labored during the Progressive Era in the factories. A lot of younger children were hired to work in the textile factories, as I said before, because the size of their fingers were small enough to get into the spools. You'll also see 3 presidents. You'll see Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. These are our 3 progressive presidents, or Progressive Era presidents. They represent that era. Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft were Republicans, and then Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. Okay. The next slide has a picture of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is, again, quintessential, big personality, go get 'em, type A, restless, got to prove to the world that he's the king kind of guy. I have mixed opinions about him. I'm a type A person. I like people that say this is what I'm going to do and go after it. But I think that he also suffered maybe a little bit from little man syndrome. Like he was always trying to prove to the world that he could do it. He was going to get it done. He was going to fix things. He wanted to fix everything. He came from a well-to-do family, a well-respected family, the Roosevelts. He had a very large family. He is the person who moved the president's offices to the West Wing, built a West Wing to the White House. His family was so large that he was distracted, and so he felt like he needed to have separate offices. And so where the Oval Office is today, that whole West Wing of the White House came about during his presidency. He also is the person who changed the name of the Executive Mansion to the White House, and so we can thank him for that. Of course, he's a huge conservationist, on and on. But he was the premier progressive reforming president. And so he's going to move in a completely different direction than previous Republican presidents who were sort of hands-off, laissez-faire, favored big business, like the whole kickback thing with the political machines. And he is going to bring progress and reform. One of the things that I noticed on many of your writing prompts on the last one, when you were asked to describe the progressive, or tell me what the Progressive Era was, a lot of you did an excellent job of putting the era in historical context, explaining what was happening during that era, the Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, the fact that the poor and the rich were very much separated. But most of you overlooked or did not quite catch what that word even means, progressive era. And I told most of you whose writing prompts I actually commented on, that I wanted you to think of the root word progress. And so the progressive era is all about progress, making changes and reforms to a capitalistic system that tended to favor the wealthy over the poor. The whole idea of Darwin's theory of evolution, how it was applied to the industrial titans that the fittest would survive, and so it's too bad for the poor guy. He just doesn't have the wits about excuse me, the wits about him to succeed. And so Teddy Roosevelt enters into the scene. He's like, you know what? There is some inequity here that is a natural process of this capitalist system. And while the idea of government hands off and letting markets and supply and demand figure it all out, human nature is kind of evil and greedy, and so perhaps government does have a role. Maybe government does have a role to play related to helping the economy and helping the little guy and creating economic freedom, the opportunities that should be available to everybody, not just political opportunity or political freedom, but economic freedom, meaning everybody should enjoy the American way of life to some extent. Not everybody's going to be rich, but should this large percentage of a population be poor? And so he's going to roll up his sleeves, and he actually becomes more and more and more and more controlling and more progressive as he ages and as he leaves the presidency, and we will see that play out here. So looking at my time. Okay, so there's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt, and during his presidency, this is actually taken from another book. You won't see this specifically in your book, but it says that progressive reforms that Teddy Roosevelt sought included these 4 things. He wanted to do what he could to protect social welfare, meaning if there were problems in the system, whether they be in the inner city, on the east side of Manhattan, in Buffalo, New York, if children were being taken advantage of in working conditions, if women were being taken advantage of, if immigrants were being taken advantage of, then it was the government's responsibility to do something about it. That's where you see a shift. It's no longer laissez-faire, government hands off. The government now in the progressive era has a significant role to play in fixing things. And so to basically social welfare. The second one was to promote moral improvement, helping people be the best that they can be. That's really significantly going to manifest itself in prohibition, and you'll see an amendment to the U.S. Constitution to limit or to outlaw the sale and consumption of alcohol. Ironically, while progressive reforms sought to improve the moral condition of our culture, in that really protecting the moral development of our society related to all classes, this is where you see feminism kind of comes out of the woodworks and promotes a significantly counter-immoral liberation of women related to sexual activity and birth control and a whole bunch of other things. So you see a couple different roads here, but in general, the progressive era sought to improve the moral condition of society. Economic reform, which was more related to working conditions for the common laborer in factories. During the progressive era, you see a minimum wage enforced in some cases. You see a minimum work hour day. You see the ability to sue your employer if you are injured on the job. You see the opportunities for, what was the other one I was thinking of? Unemployment insurance, pensions, all of these things that are designed to help and boost up the working class, those that worked in the blue-collar factory workers. So you see that happen during the progressive era. And then finally, this one's kind of obscure, but it comes up in every book related to the progressive era. You see a move away from hiring politicians to fix things, and instead, city councils and state governments begin to hire professionals to fix the organization of things. This is also where you see a lot of middle management happen in industry. And those people, of course, are not accountable to the electorate. If they don't do a good job, they can't be voted out of office. So, so that comes up in a lot of textbooks related to the progressive era. So I'm going to repeat those one more time. Progressive reform under Teddy Roosevelt sought to protect social welfare, Settlement houses is one of the examples that I give, where people like Jane Addams went in and set up these homes within communities, usually immigrant communities, to help them learn English, help them find jobs, help them get acclimated into the culture, promote moral improvement. So you see prohibition, create economic reform, which dealt with specifically working conditions in factories, and then to foster efficiency within those same systems. So hiring people who were professionals that felt like they knew how to best manage a factory, to manage a relationship between a union, those sorts of things. So, okay, then the next slide says protecting the workers, and there are 3 different cases listed there that specifically relate to limiting working hours for the average blue-collar worker in the factory. They were working way too many hours, making, I think at one point the book says the average worker made about 16 cents per hour. Excuse me. I just ate some lunch. Probably the one of I would look them all up. I don't have them in front of me. I think Mueller versus Oregon in 1908 limited the amount of working hours that women were required to work, which in some ways was for their betterment, but by restricting their hours, you restricted their pay. And so it actually in some ways punished them. The idea was that they would work the same, or they would work fewer hours for the same amount of money. So if they were making $5 a day, working 12 hours, they would make $5 a day, working 10 hours. But instead, they were hourly, and so they ended up losing money. But I'd like for you to look up each of those cases and make sure you know them. Probably the 2 that say, one says Mueller versus Oregon, the other one says Bunting versus Oregon. Those are probably the most important ones, but I want you to look them all up, scribble the facts of the cases on your PowerPoint. Again, I think I said this at the beginning of the lesson, but please, please, please print these off, take notes. Okay, also during the Progressive Era, there was a lot of reform. It didn't just take place at the national level with the lead of the president. It also took place at the state level. And so during the Progressive Era, many states state legislatures adopted reform measures related to elections. Some of them were called initiatives, some of them were called recalls, some of them were called referendums. So, for instance, I think in Arkansas we call it a referendum. No, it's an initiative, I think. So in the state of Arkansas, the state legislature every session debates about what amendments, if any, that they want to include on election day on the ballot for Arkansans to consider. And so they go through the legislative process. Almost every year for years and years and years, somebody within the state legislature wanted to introduce an amendment to legalize the medicinal use of marijuana, for instance. But generally, the state legislature resisted putting that as a possibility on the ballot, and so it just always went away. So when those supporters of medicinal marijuana in the state that were not part of the legislative body, they became frustrated by this. And so they started essentially working on an initiative where if they could collect, our Constitution says, state Constitution says, if you can get enough signatures on a ballot asking for an initiative to go on to, I think maybe it's in a referendum. I can't remember right now. Initiative, referendum, it doesn't matter. But basically it takes the hands out of the legislative body and it is placed into the hands of the people of the state. And so if they can get enough people to sign a petition, then that amendment can go on to the ballot in whenever the election is. Usually it's during the November elections. And so it takes control out of the state legislative political system and puts it into the hands of the people. And of course, in the state of Arkansas and many states across the country, this referendum or initiative was very successful in taking that particular issue out of the hands of legislatures. And so now all across the country, petitions were passed around, people signed them, and it was put on the state ballot. And once it is put on the ballot, generally it is approved overwhelmingly. In the state of Arkansas, I think it failed once, and then it passed a second time. Now in the state of Arkansas, it's still just for medicinal purposes. And so now my word on the street is there's, a move to legalize marijuana for recreational purposes, which would be a violation of federal law, but many states have already done it. And so now the state legislature is like, no way. And so there is a move. I haven't seen any petitions going around, but I'm sure that they're waiting till the medicinal shops and everything get set up, and once that becomes a normal part of our fabric, and we're not freaked out by seeing that, they probably will begin the initiative to introduce an amendment or a law to the ballot outside of the state legislative system to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. So that's kind of how that works. Some states also, not all states, but some states also included recall measures within their constitutions that if enough signatures are presented to the state legislature, they can force the state legislature to have an early election to remove someone from office. Generally, it is the governor. So in the state of California, for instance, I can't remember the governor's name. He was a Republican governor. But Californians were very, very upset with him. And so they, thousands and thousands and thousands, signed a petition asking for a recall election. They got enough votes. They presented it to the state legislature. The state legislature approved it. I think the Secretary of State of the state has to do it. And so they had a recall election of their governor a couple of years before his term was up. And that was the year that Arnold Schwarzenegger decided to run for governor in California. And so coupled with the unpopularity of the current governor, the recall election, Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't have to wait 2 years until the regular election rolled around. He got to run for governor of California because of a recall election. And he was elected governor, and I think he was re-elected governor. So, all of those progressive reforms are designed to take power out of the political system and put it in the hands of the people. That was considered a reform. Sometimes that's good and sometimes it's bad. It just depends on what the topic is. But you do need to know this. The book talks about this, but the most successful state progressive reform system was in the state of Wisconsin, and the governor's name was Robert La Follette. And he referred to Wisconsin as a laboratory of democracy, and probably their most significant contribution at the state level to the progressive reforms was that they introduced the idea of having primary systems where candidates from those political parties are chosen in a primary system before a statewide election. Prior to that, the state legislatures chose the candidates for their political parties. And I believe in all 50 states today, candidates for office have to go through a primary system. They're not those at a national level. Those candidates are not chosen from the state legislature. They're actually chosen, and the state legislator and the party. They're chosen by the people in a primary system. So just like we do the president as well. Okay, next slide. There were 4 amendments to our U.S. Constitution that were passed during the Progressive era. Most of them were not good. Again, this was a movement of the people, unhappy people. The first one is the 16th Amendment, which is probably the worst of all. The Constitution prohibits the use or the taxation unequally of people. You can't tax one person a nickel for an orange at the grocery store, and then if the next person comes in, charge them 10 cents for that orange because one's a girl and one's a boy. You can't do that. Everybody has to be taxed equally, and that came out of the system from the British where people were taxed unequally. In England, generally the poor were taxed at a higher rate than the rich, or they had more excessive taxes, and so they forbid that in the Constitution. Well, because tariffs were the primary revenue generator for the federal government, and tariffs kind of went up and down, and depending on trade, was not a reliable source of income, and the federal government during this era was expanding. It became kind of a cool idea to, hey, why don't we tax rich people? I mean, what's it going to hurt them? And so I think it was President Taft who was the primary proponent of this, but the 16th Amendment permits Congress to tax people differently based upon their income. So they call it a graduated tax system. And so just for numbers, let's say your parents make $100,000 a year. If they make between $75,000 and $100,000 a year, then they pay a I'm just making these numbers up, 25% federal income tax rate. So their income is taxed for every dollar a quarter. Let's say your parents make $500,000 a year. Well, then because you're rich, the idea is you could pay more. You don't need all that money yourself. So you might be taxed at 50% of your income. So if you make between, let's say, $350,000 and $500,000 a year, then you pay 50% of your income in taxes. And then today, there's a huge percentage of the population that pays no federal income tax, because if you make less than a certain amount, you don't have to pay any federal income tax. I think it's like 47% of Americans pay no federal income taxes, which I think is robbery. I think it's a complete violation of the Constitution. But at the time, it sounded like a great idea, and I think it was the tax applied only to the top 5% income makers. And of course, anytime you give the government a little bit of something, it expands and expands and expands. We're actually at a smaller percentage of income tax during this current presidency. That it was reduced during President Bush's administration, and I don't think President Obama ever increased it, although he probably wanted to. And then President Trump actually introduced a lower tax bracket, so they kind of consolidated several different levels into, I think, 3 groups. So I think the same percentage of people still don't pay federal income taxes, but I think it reduced the amount of federal income taxes that the general population pays. So the idea being the less taxes people have to pay, the more money they spend on their own, and the more money they spend on their own, states have larger sales revenue. It stimulates the economy, so then the economy grows. That's generally how it works, minus a coronavirus epidemic. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution changed the way that we elect senators. It used to be directed at the state legislative level, where they would choose the candidates for the United States Senate, the federal or national Senate. The 17th Amendment changed that. Now we vote for our senators just like we vote for our members of the House of Representatives. They are directly elected by the people in the state. The 18th Amendment, of course, is prohibition. Sounded like a good idea at the time, but honestly, most alcohol had an excise tax on it, so it was a huge revenue maker for the federal government. And when they lost that ability to tax a product, and then the Great Depression hit, it was honestly, I think the reason that they reversed prohibition was because they can tax it. Cigarettes and alcohol are often taxes on them, or excise taxes, and they're oftentimes called sin taxes. And then, of course, it was almost impossible to regulate, and crime quadrupled in large cities as a lot of those mafia bosses got control of the system. And for most people during this era, many, 50% or something, that were immigrants from Europe, they did not understand this hyper concentration or focus on alcohol, because it was a very normal part of their world. Unfortunately, in the United States, and probably this is true around the world, because of the discrepancy between the poor and the rich, alcoholism was a significant problem, especially in the cities amongst immigrant populations. And because the women's movement was becoming so strong and outspoken, one of the things that they highlighted was that a lot of poor immigrant women, or poor women in general, were being abused by their husbands, who were consuming too much alcohol. And of course, the alcohol at the time was much stronger than what is consumed today. So anyway, it didn't last very long. I think it lasted about 12 or 13 years, and then prohibition was overturned with the 21st Amendment. And then finally, the 19th Amendment, which the progressive era is largely and loudly about the women's suffragette movement. They were the reformers. They were marching. They were protesting. They were emancipating themselves. They were liberated, and they are a big part of the progressive era. They were the ones who were unable to vote, yet were very, very politically involved, and were highlighting a lot of the problems within industry, the poor and the immigrants and that sort of thing. So 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments are called the Progressive Amendments. You need to know those. And then just to kind of, again, this slide that I have here has a picture of the Capitol building. But whenever you think of the progressive era, I want you to think of the word progress. So it can mean progress or reform or leveling the playing field or government intervention or government regulation or government oversight or government control or government. At this era, government is going to come in and do whatever it has to do to regulate the economy so that everybody gets to experience political freedom as well as economic freedom. So economic freedom meaning you have the ability to advance yourself and enjoy this new American standard of living, this American dream, this American way of life. And so all of those words are associated with the progressive era. And so naturally, the conclusion that you come to then is that the progressive era greatly enlarged the power of the federal government over the economy during this time. So the years leading up to it, laissez-faire, hands off, government doesn't need to get involved in the economy. During the progressive era, it is the lay of the land. It is the way things are done. Government is supposed to intervene to regulate the economy. Okay, real quickly, I'm going to go through some of the highlights from this chapter that you didn't read. I'm just going to pretty much read from this. So the progressive era and socialism. Socialism came on the scene here again because in large part the progressive era is attempting to take what belongs to somebody else and to distribute it equally among everybody, to create a utopian system where everybody benefits from this consumer society, this mass culture, all of these things that are available. And so socialism was very popular at the time. The Socialist Party of America was founded in 1901. It manifests itself in large part out of the populist movement, the Populist Party. It was greatly supported by labor unions, labor movement. It attempted to reform oriented against, it was a reform movement oriented against capitalism, against the wealthy, against those, captains of industry and those power brokers. They supported things like free college education. If that sounds familiar, Bernie Sanders, AOC, it highlighted the impoverished conditions in the factories. It even promoted the idea, because the railroads in particular were perceived to be evil. It promoted the government ownership or takeover of railroads, which at the time would be like, because railroads were the primary source of transportation, it would be seen as maybe today if the federal government decided to take over all ownership of car dealers. That sort of thing, or the airline industry. And there has been talk over the years of doing that, believe it or not. So today those are for-profit industries, but it would be as if it was such a crucial part of our economy that the manipulation of it would need government intervention and need the government to come in and take control of it. We don't really want that, but that was the idea during the progressive era. Progressive era and strikers. So during this time, there were all kinds of strikes. It was labor unions and laborers' primary weapon that they had, because if those workers worked in an industry that affected the entire economy, if they went on strike, they had the ability to affect the economy and get everybody's attention. This time was marked by an empowered labor force that unionized and used the power of striking to draw attention to the poor working conditions, long hours, discriminatory conditions for women and children, and strikes did lead to legal form. There were lots of successful strikes during this era. Probably the most important labor union that you need to know from this section is called the Industrial Workers of the World, and it was essentially so the AFL, American Federation of Labor, and Samuel Gompers, they were more focused on skilled laborers, not the lowest ring of the labor class. So the Industrial Workers of the World represented all laborers of every stripe. It was man, woman, child, black, white, green, purple, Captain America, you name it. They represented everybody. William Haywood was the most probably famous president. I have a picture of him on here. They called the IWWs the Wobblies. So if you ever hear that expression, that's what they're talking about. But William Haywood was kind of a crazy socialist, anarchist kind of guy. And he ended up, in a weird turn of events, being kidnapped and disappeared, and resurfaced and was accused of, I think, the murder of or attempted murder of a governor who was anti-union, and he went on. He was charged with this, and Clarence Darrow, we'll talk about him later, represented him. Anyway, he was found not guilty of the crime, but it made him real super famous. So, okay, here's my first question for all of you. What I want you to do is I want you to go to the Google Classroom streaming page, and I want you to tell me what you remember about George Washington's presidency. So you can say anything you want to, and just pause the video, type what you want to in, the next person will come in and add, and I want to see all 8 names, all 8 people participating. So that's going to be part of your grade for today. So go in on there, wait to see what everybody's contribution is, and then jump in there, and I'll come back with another question in just a few minutes. Okay, I'm going to move on while you guys are doing that. Okay, Eugene V. Debs, he is the most famous socialist of the era. He actually ran for president a few times, or I think he ran for president more than once. He ran for president in 1912 against Woodrow Wilson, Howard Taft, and Teddy Roosevelt, and he actually garnered 6% of the vote. So he was a very significant voice in socialism, in the Socialist Party. He ran as a socialist. He was the leading voice of the socialist message. You probably remember reading about him earlier in the chapter. He was the president of the American Railway Union, and he ended up going to jail after the Pullman strike for his participation in that. Let's see here. All right, so the next section that I didn't have you read is titled New Feminism in the Progressive Era, or of the Progressive Era, New Feminism, I'm sorry. And so the expression feminism kind of comes to be during this era. So a lot of Christians in general, when they hear the word feminism, they have a very negative connotation that these are screaming, crazy liberal women who support abortion and free sex and everything else. In large part, that's actually true. Although I think that I sometimes refer to myself as a feminist, not in that context, obviously, because I want to redefine what that word means. In effect, during this era, women didn't have the right to vote. There were very strict gender roles within the family. Women were discouraged from chasing their dreams, from being anything other than staying at home, taking care of the family, which I personally, that's my priority, but they were discouraged from doing anything else, from getting an education. Oftentimes education was restricted. They didn't have those same things available to them. And so when I say I'm a feminist, I mean that I want to take advantage of every opportunity, the gifts, opportunities God gives me, and I want to be a voice for him, a voice for family, a voice for life. To me, feminism means strong woman, and I definitely consider myself that, but I use my voice for those things that I believe God wants, that is sacred to God. During this era, feminism was an emancipation, a throwing off of those gender roles, those forced perceptions of the era, and it did take kind of a nasty turn. So we're going to talk a little bit about those things. The expression feminism entered the world during the Progressive Era. As I said before, this is when the word comes on the scene. Feminism was marked with an almost militant push for emancipation of all previous bonds of womanhood. It rejected traditional roles of sexual behavior within society. For instance, as old as the Bible, I'll go all the way back to King David, or I could go to Abraham. The belief that it was okay for a man to have more than one wife, and to have to be married to, or to have a handmaid, and to have a wife and another wife and a handmaid, or for King David to have a harem. If the same thing were said of a woman, a queen, like a Cleopatra, for instance, who used her sexuality the same way that male leaders had done throughout the course of history, she would be painted in a very poor light, whereas the men were just men. And so women at this era were kind of fighting like that. That's not fair. why don't you apply the same standard to men, or to men that you do to women, or women that you do to men? And so it's almost, I'll use this example too. It's like every Lifeway kid that I ever know, when they leave school, they got to do something to throw off the bonds of dress code, or piercings, or tattooing, or hair color. They want to do something that they have not been able to do. Not that in and of itself, any of those things are wrong. It's just whatever your personal, whatever you want to do is fine. As long as it's biblical. But like even my own two kids, they both got tattoos in the summertime after they graduated. But there's nothing wrong with that, in my opinion. But what happened during the feminist era is they threw off those bonds and they went like 180 degrees the other direction. And they embraced things that were immoral. And they certainly promoted the idea of eventually of sexual liberation, that sex was no longer just about having babies and producing a family and being a mom, but it was a way for a woman to express her freedom and her emancipation. And if the boys are doing it, then she can do it too, which obviously is totally off the rails. And if ultimately the feminist movement does embrace abortion, contraceptions, which went against the church's values at the time. And that's a whole nother discussion because the church is still split on that. Let's see here, what else? There was a movement called the lyrical left, which oftentimes in a lot of these large cities, those very liberal elements coalesced around one another, and they partied together, and they wrote together, and they created art together. One of the ones the book talks about is Greenwich Village in New York, which ultimately kind of became a hubbub of the homosexual community and free sex and all of that stuff. And it's called the lyrical left. Basically, it's describing it as an artistic expression of the freedom and emancipation that they wanted to happen during this progressive era of progress. And so all that said, not everybody that was fighting for a woman's right to vote were doing those things, but that was definitely an element of it. Could have been in the sidelines, but it was still a significant element of it that has carried over till today. One of the most famous people that women that came out of this new feminism, and specifically the birth control movement, is a woman by the name of Margaret Sanger. I guess it was a couple of years ago when we did the online course through NWAC, the online professor had our students do a writing assignment on her. And she's a little bit of a lightning rod within the pro-life community because she's a pseudo-founder of Planned Parenthood, and she would go into, and it wasn't called Planned Parenthood at the time, but she would go into immigrant communities and essentially pass out contraceptive methods to women, and pamphlets and books and flyers and magazines on why it was important. But she targeted specific immigrant groups, in particular Jewish immigrants, and there was definitely a racial or discriminatory prejudicial element there. And one of my students was Jewish and took a great offense to the fact that this professor was even asking them to write about this woman. Margaret Sanger famously said, I'm going to actually quote her, "We want to exterminate the Negro population, through contraceptive. If you could convince poor black people to stop having babies, then you could reduce the number of black people in the community." And so that was kind of one of the founding blocks of Planned Parenthood, and that's part of the reason they show up in a lot of these poor communities that are primarily black. And so she also believed in eugenics, which is kind of perfecting the human race by selecting who has babies and who come together to have babies and all kinds of things. So she was not a role model for feminism, for sure. But she was a very, very important part of the feminist movement, in particular the birth control movement that came to be during this era. Seems really early in history to have this sort of conversation. But it was happening, and it was part of the progressive era. That's part of the reason we're talking about it. Next, the social gospel movement reforms that were part of the progressive era. We mentioned them in the previous period. Jane Addams and the settlement houses. Jane Addams was a single woman that chose not to get married, instead to pour her love and her heart into the immigrant communities and helping them, especially all of these poor women that had more children than they could take care of. A lot of these Irish immigrants were Catholic. The Catholic Church, even to this day, I think, is opposed to any kind of birth control. They believe you should have as many children as God ordains, and that we as human beings should not intervene in what God has preordained. And so they ended up having huge families, and they were some of the poorest immigrants among us. And so she sort of focused in on those immigrant communities, and these settlement houses were built within the neighborhoods, the immigrant neighborhoods, and these had nothing to do with the contraceptive movement. These were places where immigrants could come to learn to speak English. They could look for job opportunities. Their children could be taken care of. They could meet their health needs. So it was kind of like a Samaritan community center. It's kind of what it was. But it focused specifically on immigrants. And so she spent her whole life in these settlement houses, and that was part of the social gospel movement that was happening during the progressive era. Okay, Teddy there's a really cool picture here of Teddy Roosevelt and a guy by the name of John Muir. If you've been to, I think, Muir Woods outside of San Francisco, which is a redwood forest, it's beautiful. I believe that's named after him. But another part of the progressive movement was the conservation movement. The progressive era was the conservation movement. The conservation movement believed that we needed to protect America's greatest treasure in its nature, the beautiful landmarks that we have. And so Yellowstone was actually the first national park. I think it became a national park in 1880, something like that. Let's see here. Yosemite National Park and several other parks came under the conservation movement and were protected lands. And Teddy Roosevelt is probably the most famous conservationist. He was an outdoorsman, an avid hunter, loved the outdoors. He wasn't opposed to, developing land. He just felt like there needed to be some set aside, and so he was he was in the middle. He wanted to set some aside, but he also wanted to develop, and so he was always weighing the benefits of doing whichever. So, but during his presidency, a lot of land was put under federal control, and some of it became national parks and whatnot. All right, and then, okay, I'm going to ask you guys another question. I want you to go to the streaming page on Google Classroom, and the next question is, tell me what you remember about John Adams' presidency, okay? Tell me what you remember about John Adams' presidency, the important events. So pause, go to Google Classroom, wait for your classmates to chime in. Actually, I think this is probably going to be the last one that I ask for time purposes because I'm already almost on 50 minutes. So, so pause me, go look at the stream on Google Classroom, and continue the conversation with your classmates, then jump back into the video. Okay, I have the three progressive presidents listed one more time, and it lists all of the significant contributions, important events of their presidency, and I'm going to go through them really quick. Teddy Roosevelt was known for his square deal. That's when he became president. He said he was going to make a square deal for every American. He was believed that the president was a steward of the public welfare. He went after trust and monopolies. He asked Congress to vote for the Hepburn Act, which was federal intervention, economic intervention against the railroad, and I believe it actually allowed the federal government to set rates for the railroad. He also promoted the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act. He ran for election in 1912, not as a Republican, but as a Bull Moose candidate. He didn't care for how his friend Mr. Taft was doing, and so he ran against him. And during this era, during this election period cycle, he became uber progressive, like extreme. The Republicans didn't want to nominate him because President Taft has already served 4 years, and they felt like that would be a betrayal, and that's why Teddy ran under the Bull Moose political party. He believed during this time his platform was what was called New Nationalism, so it was an increase of the progressive era. Government should control and direct the economy. He called for heavy taxes on personal and corporate fortunes and federal regulations of railroads, mining, and oil companies. So he went a little crazy. William Taft was a little bit more conservative. He was handpicked by Teddy Roosevelt to run as the Republican candidate. But as time marched on, Teddy was not happy with how Taft was conducting himself. Taft did go after more trusts and monopolies than Teddy did. In fact, he went after Standard Oil, which was Rockefeller's company, that Teddy said, they're okay, they're a benefit to society, so we're going to leave them alone. And then William Taft did strongly support the 16th Amendment for the graduated tax. Woodrow Wilson is our next president. He was a little bit older. He'd been president of Princeton Seminary, Princeton University, maybe even seminary. His dad was a Presbyterian minister. He had served as governor of New Jersey, and he proposed what was called the New Freedom, not New Nationalism, New Freedom. And so he was a progressive as well. He intended to enlarge the federal government during his time, and he certainly did. He strengthened antitrust laws. He encouraged the protection of the right of workers to unionize, which traditionally Republicans have rejected. And he encouraged small business development. So that's kind of where he deviated from the others. He had a little bit of a focus on small business. In addition to that, Woodrow Wilson helped push through a new Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System that he introduced is still in charge today, and they largely control America's monetary policy, their interest rates, a whole host of things. So Woodrow Wilson's probably largest contribution to the progressive era is the introduction of the Federal Reserve System. I liken the Federal Reserve System to Alexander Hamilton's National Bank in some ways. It's an extension of the federal government, but it's not necessarily a part of the federal government. It operates outside of it, yet it's printing our money, it's making policy, its leaders are appointed by the president. But effectively, it's not an arm. They're not elected officials, but they certainly serve at the pleasure of the president. So there's a little bit of overlap there. All right. Whew. That covers off on the, I think, 25 pages that I had to read. Whew, it was a lot of stuff. So the last part of our instruction today, I'm sitting at 50 minutes on my video here, which means technically, give or take time for you guys to go in there and write your responses to my questions. You have about 30 minutes of class time left. And so what I would like for you to do is I found a video series actually recommended by another AP teacher that I know. And it's Heimler's History. I've shown you one of his videos in the past. He's kind of a bearded guy, bald, and he's pretty entertaining, and his videos are fairly short. And I think he has an entire series on all of the periods. And I think he's a little bit more entertaining than like Khan Academy and some of those that we've watched. And I think that he'll review the information well. So anyway, all that said, he has 3 short videos on the progressive era. He talks about the progressive era generally, and then he has a 5 or 6 minute video on Teddy Roosevelt, and then he has like a 5-minute video on President Wilson. And so I have included the links for you. I'd like for you to watch those in the remainder of our time today, pretending like we're in class. And excuse me. So when you see the film strip in the video links are at the beginning of the PowerPoint, and I also include them in my instructions for the class. Don't forget to turn in your Google Doc form so that I know that you have watched this. I understand that some of you are watching it on double time. I've found out since that some of my freshmen are also doing that. They're turning their lessons in like 35 minutes, and I'm like, So You're juniors, you guys decide for yourselves if that's something you want to do. I don't think that it's a good idea, but some of you are naturally brilliant and you can absorb the information quicker than others. Whatever. You're juniors now, I'm going to let you decide that for yourself. But I do want you to watch these 3 videos, and when you fill out the Google Doc form at the end of class today, it asks you if you watched them. And then the very last slide is our instructions for your homework. There's about 13 or 14 pages that I want you to read from chapter 19. In my instructions, I'm going to include the terms from chapter 18. I'm going to include the chapter 18 publishers quiz. See if you can answer them, or if once you've watched this lesson, if you feel like you are adequately prepared. I'm just going to give you the answer key for time's purpose. And then also, I'm going to include the period questions, and so I'll let you know which ones are covered in chapter 18. So I'm not going to have you turn in your period questions until we're done with period 7. I just have got too many. I've got 65 kids I'm trying to follow on Google Classroom, and I'm dying trying to keep track of everything. So I will ask for those down the road. And then last thing, I'm at 55 minutes. This is a long one. Sorry, guys. The last thing I want to say is that I am going to put together some additional videos that are specifically review for the exam. Rather than spending a whole lot of time in our lessons here, I'm going to just create an entire different set of videos that review for the exam periods 3 through 7. So you'll see that coming down the pipe pretty soon. If you are taking the exam, you need to let me know. I have had several parents text me and let me know, but I haven't heard from about 3 or 4 of you. So I guess there's only 7 of you. So I've heard from, I think, 3 parents or kids. So let me know if you're planning on taking the exam. I hope that you are. And I think that's all for now. So adios. Do your lesson. Turn in your Google form. And I love you guys. I miss you. Bye.